stars at night are big and bright, deep in the heart of Texas.
Hi, good people. Welcome back to A Fork in Time. This is Chris Coppola. I'm joined today by, I guess, the other, default member of the cast. Would that be a good way to put it?
I thought you were going to say in no particular order again, since there's only me.
I mean, okay, here's the thing. In this instance, I could actually say in no particular order because I am not calling on you in a particular order. You are the next person, so just by nature, you're going to introduce yourself.
Hey, everybody, it's Dylan.
So I just want to, we keep talking about the pre-podcast discussion. Man, I wish I had this one as a mixtape. We've got a really good idea, a really good episode, a lot of ideas here. Dylan, this was yours. You actually suggested this. So do you want to kind of take away and run with it for a bit?
Yeah, so this is kind of an interesting, weird, sort of wacky election story that I ran across a few months ago and I've been kind of percolating on. We're going to go back to 1948. We're going to a very fascinating election that is going to have huge impacts, specifically as regards to one very, very, very famous politician, starting kind of in the 50s and more in the 60s, and that is Lyndon Johnson. Lyndon Johnson in 1948 is a congressman from Texas. He is a 12-year congressman running against former, recently left office governor of Texas, Coke Stevenson, in the Democratic primary for U.S. Senate. This is the election where Senator Lyndon Johnson becomes a senator, which allows him to then be selected by Kennedy as his vice president in 1960, and then he takes over as president, and we get the hot mess of the 1960s. So this is where all this starts. But Johnson, just to give you an idea of the time, this is Texas in the 1940s.
This is the Democratic primary, which is the election.
That's exactly what I was going to say. This is the Texas Democratic primary basically is the election at this point, because this is the period, sort of still the Reconstruction period of Southern politics, where you have kind of the New Deal Democrats are kind of widespread, but they're still predominantly coming out of sort of New England, because that's, Roosevelt was from New York. And in the entire rest of the South, you have the solid belt of conservative Dixiecrats, who are still very much Democrats, but a very different wing of the party. And those Dixiecrats pretty much control the entirety of electoral politics all across the South. So in general, if you're in a Democratic primary in any of these states, you have a pretty solid chance at being the guy who wins the general election, but especially in Texas. Basically, if you win this, you're locked in for the election. So that's where we're in the Senate election of 1948. Johnson, congressman, versus former governor Coke Stevenson. This is an incredibly close election. This election was decided by 87 votes. Now, where our fork is going to go in this timeline is I'm going to tell you a magical story about box number 13. So Johnson, just to give you an idea, during the course of this campaign, he was campaigning like a maniac. All respect to the man. The man campaigned like nobody's business, but he kind of took some liberties with it. He flew around Texas in a helicopter that everyone called the Johnson City Windmill. And he actually landed the Johnson City Windmill at a Coke Stevenson campaign rally once. Just like came down straight in the middle. People had to clear out. He's just creating a ruckus. But Johnson also has a whole lot of influence with the Texas Democratic Party machine, which is where box 13 comes in. The election was so close that they actually initially called the election, kind of the preliminary results on election night, for Coke Stevenson, but they still had to count all the votes because it was so close. And then 5 or 6 days later, in Jim Wells County, Texas, they discover in box 13 of the voter records of Jim Wells County an extra 203 votes that previously had not been counted. They basically just magically appeared. These 203 votes were in alphabetical order, like someone had just copied them down straight off the voter registration records. They were all in the exact same handwriting, which was all different from the rest of the voter rolls. Like it's, all the normal handwriting, and then 203 votes at the end in the same handwriting. 200 of these votes were for Johnson. 3 were for Stevenson. Johnson essentially only wins this election because of these magically found 200 votes at the last second. This case actually goes all the way up to the Supreme Court. Interestingly enough, for all my legal nerds out there, Hugo Black, who was a sitting Supreme Court justice at the time, actually was the judge at the initial lawsuit, because at the time, the Supreme Court judges would also ride their circuit and hear like normal cases. So Justice Hugo Black actually heard the initial case. Johnson took it all the way up to the Black ruled for Johnson. Coke Stevenson appealed. He won the appeal. Johnson took it all the way up to the Supreme Court. Future Supreme Court Justice Abe Fortas, who is a friend of Johnson's, would argue Johnson's case in front of the Supreme Court that he would later sit on, including Justice Hugo Black, who had ruled the original case. This thing is wild. It gets even better. In 1952, after Johnson has been a senator, there's
would be when he's running again.
Yeah, I think this is heating up right as no. This is like his 4 years in. He's not running again until 54. So basically, but Johnson's been senator for 4 years. In 1952, one of the deputy marshals, or the deputy sheriffs from Jim Wells County, his name is Sam Smithwick. He writes a letter to Coke Stevenson, who at this point has been kind of wandering in the wilderness, and it's like, hey, I have some juice on this election you might want to know about. Coke Stevenson, by the time he gets to the prison where Smithwick is serving time for trying to kill a man, basically deputy sheriff in Texas, rural county, has a side job as a hitman. It's exactly what you would expect. By the time Coke Stevenson gets to the prison where Smithwick is serving a time for trying to kill this guy, actually, he did kill the guy. It was murder. It was not attempted. Stevenson gets there and finds that Smithwick has been, and I say this with heavy air quotes because of the timing, Smithwick has been hanged in his cell because he committed suicide because he was going to give dirt on Johnson's election to Coke Stevenson. This thing is wild. It's like a season of True Detective that never got made. It's just absolutely ridiculous. So what we're going to say is...
By the way, Hollywood out there, we will write the screenplay if we can cast Matthew McConaughey.
Because he's from Texas.
Right.
And Woody Harrelson, too. It's all there. It writes itself. So that's where we are, is we're focusing on box 13 in this election. And our fork is, in the initial election, they discover box 13, but it is ruled as, those extra 200 votes are ruled as invalid because, they're found too far after the election. They're clearly forged because of the handwriting and the alphabetical order, whatever. Basically, they're frankly,
just at any of these, because you mentioned, I assume this started in like federal district court.
Yeah, exactly.
It's way up at any of these points.
Yeah. Coke Stevenson ends up winning. Basically. Right. So, through whatever legal means or political means, basically, we're going to say there's a bunch of places it could happen.
It's a machine. It's machine politics, them discovering it and actually admitting, but in a court of law outside of the machine, federal, that's a little more.
Yeah, exactly. So basically, at the end of the day, Coke Stevenson, former governor, becomes senator in 1948, and Lyndon Johnson is instead forced out into the wilderness. Now, at first, this doesn't really have a huge impact in terms of stuff that we would recognize in terms of things that are going to go different. Johnson, when he's a first-term senator, he kind of doesn't really have a ton to do for the first few years. He does eventually become minority leader because he does have a way with people. The Johnson treatment is a real thing. And then he becomes majority leader of the Senate when they retake the Senate in 56. But it's only really once he's majority leader that he starts really having a huge impact on things.
But this is also, again, like 48 50 is when Nixon wins in 50.
Mhm.
Like Kennedy comes in
52.
48,
Oh no, yeah,
as a House member.
Yeah, exactly.
Right.
Yeah. You're right.
So like the freshman class of 48 is kind of crowded. It coming
48, 50, 52,
even
even 54
today,
for congressmen and senators is just
larger
wild.
He's majority leader in 56. He said.
Yeah, I think so. I think that's when they take the House, the Senate back.
Pretty.
That's impressive for basically one and a quarter terms becoming the Senate majority leader.
Yeah,
it's wild. And that's 57 is really where Johnson's impact first becomes known, and it's the first big fork that's going to happen. And in 57, Eisenhower pushes to pass the first Civil Rights Act. You know, they had it's the first modern Civil Rights Act. Sorry, I should say, because they had some when they were doing the passage of the 13th Amendment.
We just got done doing the Stewart.
Exactly. Yeah, basically, we don't have to rehash all the Reconstruction stuff, but this is the first modern Civil Rights Act because this takes place in the aftermath of Brown versus Board of Education, which ruled that segregated schools were unconstitutional. This is after Eisenhower has sent in federal troops to Little Rock, Arkansas to enforce that desegregation. So this is the beginning of the modern civil rights movement at the forefront of national politics. You know, it's always been a thing in the South and in African American communities, but this is the beginning of the nationalization of it. Exactly.
If we throw it back to 48, the only
other major thing is Truman desegregating the armed forces
and splitting the Democratic Party kind of three ways at that point, and somehow winning.
Yeah, only one term.
Well, yeah.
Oh, sorry, one and a half. We'll give him credit after 45.
I consult the amendment. That I believe the amendment has something where it's like, if it's more than 2 years, it counts as your term.
Exactly.
So, yeah, the 44 term was his.
Yeah, it was his. But basically, that's the only other big impact that has happened in the modern era, basically since the aftermath of the Civil War. So this 57 Civil Rights Amendment, a Civil Rights Act, is for one thing, from Eisenhower, it is a huge risk. Because he's already, this is Dwight Eisenhower. This is the man who, in popular imagination in the 50s, won World War II. And he got in trouble for sending the National Guard to Little Rock, Arkansas. Like, this is the closest thing to Jesus that the American electorate have right now.
It was not the National Guard. It was 101st Airborne.
Oh, sorry. Yeah, you're right. It was the 101st. Yeah, that's even so. He has to send, Major Winters' regiment and those guys from Band of Brothers. He gets flack for this. Eisenhower gets in trouble for this with his party and with the Democrats. So now he's trying to push in 57 civil rights legislation. That is a massive gamble, which is one of the reasons why he did it in his second term. But he gets Johnson to push this legislation because Johnson, one, he's a Democrat. Two, he's the majority leader of the Senate. So, he's got to work with the party in power. And three, Johnson is the one who has all these connections and stands with a foot in both major camps of the Democratic Party. Because he's, by temperament, he's a New Deal guy. Later Johnson would go on to be basically the second wave of these New Deal programs. Roosevelt had all of the Great Depression stuff, Social Security Administration. Johnson had Medicare, Medicaid, the so-called Great Society programs. So that's Johnson by temperament. But by upbringing, kind of nature versus nurture argument here, if we're going psychologically, he has grown up, he has cut his political teeth in the heart of conservative Dixiecrat Democrat country.
When Johnson starts speaking, you think he's a Dixiecrat until you listen to what he's saying.
Yeah. If you can get past the fact that he's yelling at you and or talking from the bathroom with the door open, which, yes, was a thing that happened in Johnson's actual cabinet meetings. I'm not joking. Part two. But so Johnson becomes
right now, by the way, we've got a plan.
Yeah. So Johnson becomes a major figure in trying to get this thing passed. And what Johnson has to do is he has to try and ensure that some version of this passes without completely getting the Dixiecrats to defect, because there's already a lot of Republicans who aren't super in favor of civil rights legislation. Because you got to remember, civil rights at the time in 57, this is a very modern, current political position to have. Most of the guys in Congress, most of the wider body, we talked about kind of the political, class incoming of the late 40s and early 50s. Most of the people have been in the Senate and the Congress for 20 years at this point. So they're like, no disrespect intended. Some of these guys, actually, probably quite a few of them, are still uncomfortable with the fact that we had, African American members in the service in World War II. Like that's the mindset that these guys are coming from.
But also, a lot of the Republicans, what is a Republican in the 1950s? Well, Eisenhower, they're the uncommunists. They're the very strong uncommunism.
Yeah.
They're also, at this point, they're opposed to some of those New Deal, i.e., expansion of the power of the federal government.
This is kind of the small government pro-business Republicans.
And so small federal government.
Yeah, small federal government.
And kind of this, Goldwater, not that far from him, a lot of them think like, I support civil rights, I support equality. I just don't think it's the job of
the federal government's business.
Exactly.
Yeah. And so what Johnson has to do, and what he is not around to do in this timeline, is try and shepherd this bill through both houses of Congress to make sure that it passes in some form. And so the 57 Civil Rights Act has a lot of criticism because if you compare what was originally proposed and what actually passed, it is a very watered down version. The short version of what the actual Civil Rights Act of 57 does is it basically creates and affirmatively recognizes that there is federal oversight behind the ability of citizens to vote in federal elections. States still pick, qualifications, all the rules and all that, but states cannot procedurally disenfranchise people from voting, which is one of the big hallmarks of the Jim Crow South. Is African Americans and people of color were procedurally prevented from being able to exercise a right that they constitutionally had to vote for federal elections. So the 57 Civil Rights Act basically creates federal enforcement mechanisms and oversight mechanisms to prevent that from happening going forward. And it does some other stuff with like a oversight, like it creates a congressional commission on civil rights and some things like that. But that's really the big one.
In effect, here's what it does. Before in the election of 56, before this bill, if you were an African American in the South and somebody prevented you from voting, you could get a lawyer and you could sue for your right. This bill made it the Department of Justice now could sue basically on your behalf or sue to prevent this. Department of Justice has a lot of lawyers. Individual people don't.
Yeah.
So
the Department of Justice also has resources. Yeah.
Right.
And it guarantees the right to a jury trial in these cases. It also created a contempt fine for violating, which before was kind of confusing. But basically a lot of the stuff that they really wanted in there had to get watered out because Johnson knew that a lot of the provisions that had more teeth, let's say, a lot of those provisions were never going to pass with the Dixiecrats controlling the Senate for sure. I don't remember if they controlled the House or not, but basically the Dixiecrats were all going to walk. There were only 3 members of Congress who from the Senate, who from the South in the Democratic Party said that they would vote for it. Every single other person said that they were going to refuse to vote for it. So it's only because of Johnson that we even really have the version that we have of the Civil Rights Act, as watered down as it is.
And by the way, also kind of a legislative momentum.
Yes.
In other words, yes, this is important. Civil Rights Act of 64, Voting Rights Act of 65, federal housing, all of these things happen because this trust me, we're going to talk about foreign policy later, part 2, later on. But this is kind of the domino that falls that kind of tells the civil rights movement, the Northern New Dealers, this is actually possible. You can actually get this done. And instead of it being seen as almost a third rail and you not having any momentum to even attempt.
Yeah, exactly. And it begins the sort of natural process of the legislature where, like, you even see this today, where for the last 20 years, we've been voting on the same couple of kinds of bills primarily in Congress. Not to get too political, but basically the last 20 years have always been immigration, healthcare, maybe to a lesser extent, some education stuff. But it kind of goes in waves of like, okay, once Congress gets some momentum towards a certain area, they tend to vote on it for a while because that's where their attention is. That's the political topic of the day.
They realize these things need to be tweaked.
And that's what the 57 Act does, is it starts this momentum for civil rights. The other thing that I want to talk about with Johnson specifically.
I want to get back to.
Oh no, yeah. Keep going on 57.
I'll go take it back to the beginning of this 48 when the party split. Who led the Dixiecrats out of the party in 48?
I'm trying to think.
Let me. Don't worry, I'll get there. Rhetorical. This is a man who was a United States senator during my lifetime.
Oh yeah.
Strom Thurmond.
Yes.
Left the Democratic Party in 48 to run for president as a Dixiecrat. He's still a senator from South Carolina, so he is still in office in 57.
Mm-hmm. He sets the record for the filibuster trying to defeat this bill. He stood on the Senate floor for 24 hours.
Where he sat there and read the Washington, D.C. phone book.
Yeah.
That is how opposed to it he was.
Yeah, literally set a record that wasn't so just so y'all understand how big of a thing this was for him. Strom Thurmond set this record for a filibuster. Basically, for our non-American listeners, a filibuster is a procedural tactic of the Senate where once something is up for a vote, you can delay the vote because each senator has a certain amount of time to speak on it. And you can basically
don't have an amount of time. In the House, it's each side gets so much time.
Yeah.
And kind of
the Senate, you can just speak as long as you want, but you go in turns.
Let each person speak, I yield my time, whatever. In the Senate,
unlimited.
Senators, once they have the floor,
they have to leave it.
They have to say, I want to watch Mr. Smith Goes to Washington again, because it's either they give it or if they go to sleep. Once they basically stop talking for a certain amount of time. So that's why Strom Thurmond sits there and reads the phone book, because while he is on the floor, they literally cannot continue to conduct business until he finishes what he's doing. Basically I think it was after this, they generally got to the point where if you said you were going to do it, they didn't force that issue. Okay. Sometimes they will force the issue and say, go ahead and prove it. Go ahead and talk. And so go ahead and talk about a time that they actually forced somebody to do it.
So actually Strom Thurmond's record was not beaten from 1957 until, hold on, I'm doing some math in my head, 68 years later. It was just beaten last year in 2025 by Senator Cory Booker, who was protesting, I believe, some healthcare thing.
I thought it was the Big Beautiful Bill.
No, that's what it was. Yeah, it was the Big Beautiful Bill. And he beat it by an hour, which is impressive because Cory Booker stood on the floor for 25 hours and 7 minutes. But that's how long we're talking about. It took almost 70 years for somebody to beat Strom Thurmond's record on this bill. And that brings me to another thing that I want to talk about with this bill is the Republicans at the time, knowing that Johnson was having to thread this needle, they were kind of thinking in their heads that they were going to try and take a sort of Bismarckian realpolitik tactic of this to crack the Democratic base a little bit, because they knew if the Republicans tried to pass this bill and the Democratic Party fractured because the Dixiecrats wouldn't vote for it, the Republicans could use that. Because remember, they are still the party, they're the party of Teddy Roosevelt, the Progressive Party, ostensibly. but they're also still the party of Lincoln. They use that as an advertising point to try and win African American voters, particularly in the South, where all these Dixiecrats are in power and are voting actively against African American interests to try and win some African Americans back to the Republican Party. So that's the undercurrent of all this. Now, without Johnson, I can see Eisenhower still proposing the legislation, but I don't think it has a snowball's chance in hell of passing in any meaningful sense. There might be something called the Civil Rights Act of 57 that gets passed, but it is going to be even more watered down, basically not worth the paper that it's written on. The other interesting thing is the next year in 1958, well, before I get to 1958, because we need a break from legislation. So I'm going to talk about the procedure of the Senate structure. One of the other things Johnson was big in is he basically almost single-handedly created the modern version of the Senate Majority Leader. Johnson, when he took charge, was in charge of actually reforming the way that the committee structure for the Senate worked. Basically, all the Senate power is both your seniority, how long you've been in the Senate, and what committees you're on and what position you have on the committees. If you come from, New York and you are in a shipbuilding district, you know a lot about the Navy, you know a lot about industrial production. Before Johnson comes in, the Senate, because you're a first-year senator from New York, they could put you on the agriculture committee, and you got to learn about corn and soybeans and stuff from Arkansas and Kansas and Nebraska that you have no idea about, and you just, because of lack of familiarity, are bored out of your mind. And you couldn't get anything better until one of the older senators retired and a seat opened up, and you could move up one rung of the ladder. And then you had to repeat the process, wait for enough senators to die or retire until you could be in the at least the best seat, even if it wasn't the committee that you really wanted. Johnson reorganized this. So one, he made sure that senators actually got a spot on a committee that they knew something about. What a novel idea. If you're going to pass laws, you should probably know about the things that you're passing laws on, especially at the committee stage where you're actually actively creating the law before it gets voted on. And he also ensured that freshman senators would get a seat, because a lot of times there weren't enough committees to go around. So the freshmen would be left out in the cold and they'd basically have to sit and not really have any sway, because if you're on committees, you have influence to steer the legislation.
In the drafting of the bill, basically,
yes.
The way it's worked, the committee is where most amendments are tacked on, where the bill is drawn up, and it is sent to the floor for the vote.
Yeah, basically
like a line item, yes or no.
Yeah. So Johnson really is the one who starts this. And that's one of the reasons why he was so attractive to Kennedy, because he had so much power to be able to do this, because he still had all this pull in Congress. So without Johnson, it is still the kind of archaic, old seniority committee structure. So we don't see this kind of dynamic shift in sort of the fluidity and kind of the maneuverability of the Senate for people that come out of the Senate into the executive without Johnson. Because if he's not there to do those changes, the Senate is much more than it is now, kind of its own isolated ivory tower kind of institution that doesn't take well to outsiders. The other big legislative thing, and I know Chris really likes this one because he's got a lot of history on it, is in 1958, Johnson basically spearheads the passage of the bill that would create NASA. It's the National Aeronautics and Space Act instead of the National Aeronautics and Space Administration. So without Johnson, NASA as we know it isn't the thing that it is. But we do have some interesting thoughts on what NASA would be instead. And Chris, I know you've got more on this, so I'll let you take the heavy hitting.
So it all, it gets back to basically Sputnik. 1957, the Soviet Union actually launches a beeping basketball into space.
Such a good way to describe it.
And scares the entire world because of it. And this was, one of the things that happened was the passage of the it wasn't actually that. It was the National Defense Education Act.
Mhm.
And basically what that did is it opened federal. This was one of the first federal interventions into education and basically opened up the spigot to just throw money to get STEM graduates.
Mhm.
We're running out of Nazis to bring over, so we need to educate some of our own.
Actually, I was going to bring up. So one of the things about this act is, and one of the things that Chris actually pointed out to me, because I kind of had known it once upon a time and forgotten about it. So nowadays we think of NASA as being centered in Houston. That's why the Houston basketball team is called the Houston Rockets. We know about Cape Canaveral in
And
Florida.
the Astros as well.
I don't care about baseball.
And also why Houston, we have a problem. Why they say Houston.
Yeah. But NASA initially got its start out of some earlier programs, like the primary base of U.S. rocketry testing was in, of all places, Chris.
Huntsville, Alabama.
Yep. Huntsville, Alabama. So that is actually where Werner von Braun really primarily did a lot of his work when he first came over. And so we actually think one of the biggest impacts of Johnson not being in the Senate as far as the space program goes is whatever version NASA takes, I kind of lean towards it not really being, at least at first, a civilian administration. I think it's going to be more part of like a military offshoot, like how the Air Force was.
That's actually the interesting thing. Huntsville, Alabama is the civilian rocketry program.
Yeah.
White Sands Proving Grounds is where the military does a lot of its work. Its work is a little more focused on like V1 cruise missile weapons types versus like full ballistic intercontinental.
Yeah. But right in that same neighborhood, there's another city. One of the reasons why Houston works so well is because it's real close to the Caribbean Sea. So if you've got to have a rocket splash down, it's a lot safer to have it hit water than it is to hit land. And also, you've got a lot of land that's not terribly well settled around it. Well, Chris had an idea for another city that's also on the Gulf of Mexico, that's a little closer to Huntsville, Alabama, that has some attractive targets for what would also potentially draw something like a NASA type organization to it in terms of what it's already got there that would make the infrastructure setup really easy.
Keesler Air Force Base is in this period, the United States Air Force's training ground for people specializing in radar and electronics. Basically, if you are joining the U.S. Air Force, you do basic training, and then you get sent out to your specialist school. If you're going into electronics, it's in Keesler, which is in Biloxi, Mississippi. If you can imagine basically where Biloxi is, it's that, I'm just going to say this, Alabama and Mississippi look like they're the same state.
Yeah, pretty much.
Mirror image of each other. And if you want to know where Biloxi is, it is the tiny little sliver of Mississippi that actually touches the Gulf of Mexico. It's already got a little bit of I mentioned Keesler, it's got a lot of people coming through there who are specializing in the kind of things you need to know if you are trying to actually like build a space program, if that makes sense.
Yeah. And so I think without NASA being based in Houston, Biloxi or the greater Gulfport, Biloxi kind of area, because Gulfport's the really big city that's close to Biloxi. Biloxi's really kind of tiny. That kind of area is the next kind of more natural spot for NASA because there's a lot of land around that area. I mean, Mississippi's got some farms and stuff, but that part of Mississippi, it's basically Louisiana. Like it's very swampy, very rural. Like if a rocket goes down in the middle of the woods, it's not that much more of a deal than it is if it goes down in the Gulf.
Also, by the way, there's a natural nickname for Brett Favre now. That's about where he's from, right?
Yeah,
Yeah.
he's I forget exactly where he's from, but he's from that part of Mississippi. So yeah, rockets are going to shoot out of Mississippi now. Is one thing that we talked about, but the really big, obviously, like I talked about in the beginning, Lyndon Johnson really starts to impact, U.S. politics and world politics once he becomes vice president, because he's Kennedy's man behind the scenes. He's the guy Kennedy uses to wrangle the legislature to get stuff done. And he's kind of, Kennedy is a freshman senator when he runs for president in 1960. So Johnson brings that sort of one level of experience and two geography balance that Kennedy, as a Northeastern liberal Democrat and a Catholic,
And
really needs to focus on doing. Yeah.
And to hold the party together. That's the
exactly. Yeah. So that is why Johnson is such a big deal in 1960. And then that's what gets him onto the stage for the 1960s, which is really where most of his impact is. So without Johnson, Kennedy has to look elsewhere for this 1960 election. And we had a couple of interesting candidates. There's a lot of famous people in both the Republican and Democratic parties. If you're like, oh, I've kind of heard that name, but are not really famous. And who did we have, Chris? I don't want to start with our leading candidate.
I want to start with your home state.
Oh, yeah. The guy I didn't know about.
Estes Kefauver.
Yeah, Estes. I don't know if it's Kefauver or Kefauver, but
no, it's Kefauver.
Oh, is it? Okay.
Yeah. So, I have a nice thing working here. Estes Kefauver is one of the two. There were 3 Southern senators that did not sign the Southern Pledge, which said we are not under any circumstances supporting any of the Civil Rights Act of 57. The other one was Johnson. Estes Kefauver was one of them, and I believe the other one was Al Gore Sr.
Senior? Yeah, I think that's right.
So the only things to know about Kefauver, you will ever hear about Kefauver. One, senator from Tennessee for a little bit, signed that pledge. The other thing is he was very famous in the 50s for having hearings on organized crime. He is actually mentioned in Godfather 2.
Is he really?
Yes.
Okay, I'll have to go rewatch that.
That's right.
Yeah. And that's pretty much all you need to know about Kefauver too. Is that's basically where his influence.
Well, his commission was really those hearings were really important because, up until then, Hoover had basically been saying there is no such thing as the mafia.
Yeah.
So, in that corner of the world, those are very important hearings.
Yeah.
But
widespread, he's not a huge amount of impact.
Also, let me just say a couple of things here. One, as much as the members of this podcast love doing Native Sons, Dylan is from Tennessee.
I didn't know who this guy was.
Did not know who he was. Still is unsure as to how to pronounce the man's name.
Yeah. Not a guy that we learn a whole lot about in Tennessee history class.
It doesn't lend itself to a jingle.
Yeah, Vice President Estes Kefauver. Doesn't have a bell there. There's no ringing. One of the other guys that we talked about is more well known, especially in 1950s politics. Adlai Stevenson, the former governor of Illinois,
the first person to have Kefauver run as vice president.
Yeah, he's kind of a really interesting candidate because while he's not from the South, he does help solidify a state that Kennedy needed to keep down because there is a giant Democratic base there in Chicago, Illinois. He also, although he doesn't have the experience in the Senate that Kennedy, found in Johnson, he does have executive experience because he'd served in the Roosevelt and Truman administrations, in the Navy and the State Departments. But what he really brings is, one, he's run on campaign trails before, so he knows how that goes. But he is probably one of the main candidates Kennedy could have picked that would have been able to counter the sort of the sort of Cold War anti-communist foreign policy stuff that Eisenhower and Nixon had, because Stevenson was actually on the delegation that founded the United Nations in the aftermath of World War II, and he was the ambassador, well, not formal ambassador, but basically he was on the delegation to the UN for the first like 5 years it existed. So if anybody aside from the Eisenhower administration is going to have direct Cold War Soviet interaction based experience, it's going to be Adlai Stevenson.
Also, wasn't Stevenson the Democratic candidate in 52 and 56?
Yeah, he was in both. Yeah, so he's unsuccessfully run against Eisenhower before, which is why he makes an okay running mate, because he knows how an Eisenhower Nixon campaign kind of works. But since he's vice president, he doesn't have quite as much baggage of having to carry the ticket. But we found actually a third guy who we think is actually even better. Oh no, sorry, don't want to jump ahead.
No, because there's still somebody else to talk about that.
Oh yeah.
This is why our pre-podcast was so long, because we're just debating all of these. Richard Russell, senator from Georgia, is in the Senate with Johnson, builds a relationship with Johnson in our timeline. It's very important listening to the Johnson tapes in the Civil Rights Act of 64 and Voting Rights of 65. There's a lot of work that Johnson is doing on Russell to try and make sure these things get passed. Russell was never going to support it himself, but it was basically Johnson. That's why you want Johnson around, because he has those relationships with the people in the Senate. And also, I was arguing for Russell. One, it is a geographic balance of the ticket. Basically, a Massachusettan needs a Southerner to keep the Democratic Party together. Yeah. The other interesting thing is, to this day, I think it was Caro wrote the biography of Johnson as the Master of the Senate. To this day, one of the Senate office buildings is named after Dick Russell.
Yeah.
So he is one of those people that checks the Southerner box and also brings the Senate gravitas to the ticket that a newbie doesn't have.
Yeah. And I think the only problem with Russell and why we don't go with him is, I think, one of the reasons why Johnson worked for Kennedy is because even though he was from Texas, Dixiecrat country, at his heart, he was a New Deal Democrat. So he could balance both sides. I think as much as Kennedy recognizes the political expedience that Russell puts on the ticket, one, I don't know that Kennedy thinks he can fully trust Russell to stay in line in terms of the speaking part for some of the stuff Kennedy's going to want to do, because you don't want to have to fight your vice president candidate on the campaign trail.
When I want to do civil rights bills in the Senate, I need you to I'm relying on you to use your connections. I want you to actually use them in the direction I'm trying to make that happen.
Exactly. And even make the statements believable. And also, I think Russell, is too ardent of a segregationist white supremacist. Like he is basically number two in that camp behind only Strom Thurmond. And Strom Thurmond is never going to be on a Kennedy ticket. So I think Kennedy just is never going to choose him if he has any say in how his own campaign is structured. But we did find another really interesting person who actually is around kind of under the surface in this time. And honestly, today, he's not really remembered too much outside of if you're in the sort of academic field and trying to get some funding money. And that is the man behind the Fulbright Scholarship. And his name is J. William Fulbright. And we like him for a couple of reasons. One, he was kind of a segregationist, but not to the level of like Russell and Thurmond. He was, and I'm trying to not make this sound terrible, he was kind of a normal segregationist for the time. He was sort of milquetoast about it. He was segregationist in the sense that almost every elected politician from the South in that time was, to some degree or another, but he never got politically famous for being a segregationist. So he's at least somebody in that camp that Kennedy can probably deal with and do business with. But he's from Arkansas, which those of you who remember Bill Clinton's campaign, Bill Clinton, very much Arkansas is a southern place. Anybody who's ever hear him talk is going to know that. He's from Arkansas. He has direct experience in the segregationist fight in terms of he was the governor when Eisenhower sent the 101st in there. He would have been involved in Arkansas with the civil rights passage or around.
And not to get back and get too much into the nitty gritty of what happened in Little Rock. That wasn't Eisenhower's first choice. He had to use those federal troops because Fulbright would not call out the guard, and two, wasn't sure if he could and what they would do if they were called.
Yeah. And then Fulbright also has some foreign policy benefits because, for one, he's an Anglophile. He studied in Oxford. So he's always had huge connections with the Brits, which, this is, at this time, Britain and France are kind of the main European legs of this kind of anti-communist sort of alliance that the U.S. is trying to build in NATO and the United Nations. So he has a natural predilection towards communication with the UK on the foreign policy front.
I also have to say this, thinking about Kennedy, one, no Irish American is going to have that positive a relationship with the United Kingdom.
Yeah, it's a very good point.
Especially one whose father, got himself appointed as ambassador to London as a giant FU to the empire. Two, basically told the British they were finished in the summer of 1940.
Yeah. So Joe Kennedy, not a great diplomat.
Oh, there's some rebuilding of that special partnership that needs to happen.
Yeah.
And maybe somebody with the name Kennedy isn't the best person to do it.
Yeah. But Kennedy also has some really, Fulbright also has some really interesting kind of anti-communist fame at this point, because so in the early 1950s, that was the heyday of the McCarthy hearings, the Red Scare. Fulbright was one of the few people in all of those subcommittees. So he's got experience with foreign relations, intelligence, all of that stuff from the Senate. He was basically the only person on the committee that refused to fund McCarthy's like super fancy brand new Senate committee that he wanted to lead to investigate all of these Red Scare people. Fulbright basically said, no, screw off. I don't trust you. You're crazy. He was basically the only dissenting vote. And he was particularly a thorn in McCarthy's side, which once the McCarthyism of the early 1950s ends, he's going to look like kind of a golden boy for having seen the light all along and not have succumbed to kind of the outrage of that sort of whole system.
And there's also something to be said for, we talked a little bit about Sputnik. The idea of the missile gap in the election of 1960 is a huge deal that basically the Democrats are saying, hey, Republicans, you guys were asleep at the wheel. We're now behind the Soviet Union. And he's got a lot of bona fides to be talking about that issue. Also, let's not forget about Nixon's closeness and relationship with the Red Scare.
Yeah.
This is also a really good point to have him out there talking about, tarring Nixon with the
sort of crazy brush of the Red Scare. Yeah.
Yeah.
And Fulbright also has some of the more, I don't want to say productive, just because that suggests that the kind of hardline anti-communists weren't productive, but a more constructive foreign policy experience rather than just purely, we hate the communists, rah, 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 let's go blow them up. Because Fulbright was one of the big guys behind the some of the early stages of the development of the Marshall Plan, and also the European coal and steel community, which European Union historians of you may note that was what became the European Union. It was the progenitor of it. So he has European foreign policy experience in the negotiation of these kind of multinational productive agreements that the U.S. is trying to encourage as a sort of counter to what they see the Soviets doing with, the Iron Curtain, the kind of domino effect, paranoia, and all of that. So he's going to be an attractive foreign policy counter for Kennedy to have as a vice president, because he can't really say other than, oh, I was, in a fighter plane in World War II. He doesn't have a whole lot of foreign policy experience other than shooting bullets at things. So he needs somebody who's got the diplomatic side of that.
Wrong brother.
Was that Bobby?
No, that was
Joe. That was Joe. Joe Jr. Sorry,
he swam.
Yeah, that's right.
He tried to ram a destroyer with a rowboat and wound up swimming because of it.
That's right. Sorry. It's so easy to get all the Kennedys confused. But basically what I'm getting at is Fulbright presents if you can't get Johnson and get your ability to maneuver the Senate, Fulbright is a good counter to the more immediate problem of Nixon.
And he's a Southerner that will keep the Dixiecrats online. And he's also been a governor, executive experience, and he's got some domestic policy chops.
Yeah.
In a way that like a Dean Acheson may not.
Yeah. And he's kind of a good all-rounder. And, the big thing with Kennedy is everybody talks about Kennedy versus Nixon because Nixon has 8 years of experience in the White House already, playing second fiddle to Eisenhower with all these Cold War people. So Kennedy needs somebody in his camp who's believable. So I think Fulbright, along with all the other stuff, really makes that a much more cohesive ticket to counter sort of Nixon's sort of Eisenhower 3 return of the whatever you want to call Nixon.
I mean, I feel like that just should be called the 19th hole. That was the
Sure. Yeah. So, with that, I guess, what do we think? Do we think that the lack of Johnson is going to torpedo the election for Kennedy? Do you think he still wins? What do you think actually happens in the election, Chris?
I mean, I think they wind up winning. I
do think Kennedy still wins the debate. That's such a big PR moment for him.
The other thing I think is maybe because Fulbright is a little more in the Dixiecrat camp. Actually, in 1960, Harry Byrd, Virginia senator, he's related to, but he's not the West Virginia senator who was also around forever. There are a couple of Democratic. Yes, we have foreign listeners. I need to talk about this. Even American listeners kind of don't understand how this happens sometimes. Electors are elected as Democrats, and they got to the Electoral College, and they voted for Harry Byrd.
Yeah, instead of John F. Kennedy, the Democratic candidate.
And I think because Fulbright might firm up some of that support, I think.
Yeah. So that basically what we're saying is that might at least put Mississippi and Alabama, which primarily electorally voted for Byrd, more in play with the rest of the solid South for a Kennedy Fulbright, because remember, he's a senator from Arkansas, ticket. And so I think that helps make up, and that also potentially helps him keep Texas. Chicago's kind of up in the air, but even if Kennedy loses Illinois in this timeline, he still, I think, got enough of the solid South to make up for it and still win an electoral college victory. So I think what that ends up seeing is Nixon continues to go wander in the wilderness for at least 4 years, maybe 8. You have Kennedy and Vice President William Fulbright now taking the stage in 1960. And before we go any further into all of the stuff that the 1960s hold,
because we have ideas.
Yeah, oh boy, do we have ideas. And one of them involves Dick Cheney using the Force. We're going to take.
It involves Johnson coming in and using something else.
Yes. So much foreshadowing. I could have called it something else, but since this is at least a nominally family-friendly podcast, I'll keep it to myself. That, ladies and gentlemen, is where we are going to end this first part of the Magical Mystery Box 13 fork. And we're going to save the aftermath of the 1960 election and the Kennedy presidency for next time in part 2. So, Chris,
I am literally renaming the folder where I save everything.
Magical Mystery Box 13?
Magical Mystery Box 13. Yeah, that's an
it's
episode.
Such a good name. It's such a good name. So with that, ladies and gentlemen, that is enough for us today. Thank you for coming to listen to another episode of A Fork in Time, as always, especially with us talking before this recording for an hour and a half. We probably are a little loopier than we might normally would, not quite as tight. So if you have any suggestions on anything, if you think of something that we left out of this episode that we missed, if you want to throw out possible ideas for what you think we might talk about in part 2, we're kind of curious to see everybody's ideas about what we might have locked and loaded in the cannon.
You know what I kind of enjoy? Let's put it out there. Throw in the Discord how you think Dick Cheney force choking somebody comes in. Yeah. We got there, but I want to see what people think how that happened.
Yeah. So, leave a comment in the Discord. Tell us what you think of the episode. If there's anything you missed, anything you want us anything you think we might touch on in part 2, any other feedback, topic suggestions, always welcome. And I will let us sign off with our usual ending, which is, if you should come across a fork in time, Chris, what should you do?
Take it.
You look like you had something there.
Yeah, I was honestly, we didn't talk about the Federal Highway Act, and I was trying to figure out how to work that in.
Oh yeah, no, that could have been good. Yeah. All right. If you come across a fork in time, shoot a rocket out of Biloxi, Mississippi at it, I guess. So with that being that, ladies and gentlemen, that's it for now. Have a good rest of your day.
Thanks for listening to A Fork in Time, the alternate history podcast. Learn more and provide feedback by visiting our website at www.aforkintimepodcast.com. Connect to us on Facebook at facebook.com/aforkintime or follow us on Twitter at AFIT Podcast. If you want to support the show financially, visit our Patreon page at patreon.com/aforkintime. We hope you will join us next time.